The golden age of the Ottoman Empire, which reached its peak under Süleyman the Magnificent, gave way to the era of his son, Selim II, whose image in history remains shrouded in a thick fog of legends and contradictions. Known to his contemporaries as the Blond, this ruler left behind not only expanded state borders, but also one of the most debated mysteries of the Ottoman dynasty. When the life of the 11th Sultan abruptly ended within the lavish interiors of Topkapı Palace, the event gave rise to numerous rumors and conflicting versions that have survived to this day. But what really happened behind closed doors? Was it a tragic accident on slippery marble, a sudden stroke, or was a cunning conspiracy brewing behind the Sultan's back? Why did the Sultan, as if sensing his imminent end, radically change his habits in the final months of his life? And who stood to benefit from his sudden death at such a critical moment for the state? In this video, we will conduct a detailed analysis of all versions of Selim II's death, from official chronicles of a stroke to theories of poisoning and domestic accidents. We'll examine his final days, compare historical facts with the fictional portrayal in the series, and find out why the Sultan's entourage needed to conceal his death for a full 12 days. Selim II ascended the Ottoman throne in 1566, bearing on his shoulders a colossal burden of responsibility, the legacy of his father, Süleyman the Magnificent. His appearance sharply distinguished him from his predecessors: fair hair and blue eyes. This unusual look for an Eastern ruler was a direct reflection of his origins, as Selim's mother was the legendary Sultan. Becoming Sultan at the age of 42, Selim II faced a paradox. The empire was at the zenith of its power, but the very mechanism of governance required change. He became the first Sultan to refuse to personally lead military campaigns, preferring to remain in the capital or in Edirne. Critics and Western envoys immediately dubbed him the drunkard, but everything was not so straightforward. Selim understood that the vast machinery of the empire could not be managed from the saddle during months-long campaigns. He entrusted state affairs to Grand Vizier Sukulu Mehmed Pasha. Could a weak ruler have kept such a figure as Sukulu in check? Hardly. Selim knew how to find and retain brilliant executors in their positions, which allowed the empire not only to preserve his father's territories, but also to expand them. Contrary to the myths of perpetual idleness, the reign of Selim II was marked by substantial victories. In 1571, the Ottomans conquered Cyprus, a strategic island that had long been a thorn in the Ottoman Mediterranean trade. And although that same year saw the crushing defeat at the Battle of Lepanto, Selim displayed remarkable resilience. In just 1 year, he managed to fully rebuild the fleet, making it even more powerful than before. "You have cut off our beard, but it will grow back even thicker." Mustafa Mehmet's famous phrase fully reflected the Sultan's will. Under Selim II, the empire also firmly established itself in Tunisia and Yemen. Nor should we forget his contribution to the architectural landscape of the Islamic world. If his father erected the majestic Süleymaniye, Selim II gave the world the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, which the great architect Sinan considered his finest work. This structure, with its incredible dome and graceful minarets, became a symbol of Selim's era, a time when the empire began to value art and inner comfort no less than military trophies. Was Selim truly the carouser he is often portrayed as? Rather, his reign can be called a period of stabilization, when the empire began to recognize its boundaries and transition from aggressive expansion to deep cultural and administrative integration. However, it was precisely this stability and inclination toward pleasure that laid the groundwork for the tragic and strange circumstances that cut his life short at its very peak. In the autumn of 1574, Sultan Selim II, whose lifestyle for years was associated with lavish feasts and a love of Cypriot wine, suddenly and irrevocably renounced all forms of entertainment. This was no fleeting whim. The Sultan seemed to be reborn overnight, plunging into deep melancholy and spiritual reflection. Selim ordered all festivities to cease, dismissed his favorites and musicians, and spent more and more time alone, gazing at the Bosphorus with the sorrow of a man who knew exactly the date of his departure. It is believed that the main cause of this state was a terrible fire that broke out in the kitchens of Topkapı Palace. The flames were so fierce that they destroyed a huge portion of the buildings, nearly reaching the Sultan's private chambers. For the superstitious Selim, this fire became a direct message from above. From that moment on, the premonition of imminent death became obsessive, almost tangible. He began distributing vast sums of alms to the poor of Istanbul and ordered the work on his mausoleum to be accelerated, as if he feared the architects would not finish preparing his final resting place in time.
Historians pay special attention to Selim's abrupt renunciation of wine. The Sultan's long-established daily diet, which had included elite varieties of alcohol, was suddenly replaced with a strict abstinence. But a sudden withdrawal from alcohol, to which the body had grown accustomed over decades, can be deadly dangerous. The chief court physician warned the sovereign that such a radical step would cause an agitation of black bile and fever. Selim, however, remained adamant. But the price of this change was high. The Sultan began to suffer from severe headaches, dizziness, and hallucinations. In the final weeks of his life, he confessed that Süleyman the lawgiver increasingly appeared to him in visions, urging him to finish his earthly affairs. Despite his outward composure, the Sultan suffered from insomnia. In those rare hours when he managed to drift into sleep, he would jolt awake in a cold sweat, claiming that he could hear the sound of water that would soon take him. It was during this period that Selim II began to show an increased interest in astrology and prophecies. He would summon the chief astrologer, demanding that a horoscope be cast for the end of the year. The Sultan stopped intervening in state affairs, entrusting them entirely to Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, and increasingly visited construction sites. By December 1574, Selim II reached an extreme physical and nervous exhaustion. The last day for Selim II was December 15, 1574. The official chronicles of the time give a straightforward answer regarding the cause of death. Sultan Selim II died from the consequences of a sudden apoplectic stroke, which modern science classifies as a massive stroke. This version was recorded in documents as the only correct one and was considered reliable in Ottoman historiography for centuries. According to these records, the Sultan, having decided to inspect the newly completed section of the palace baths, entered a chamber where high humidity and a sharp temperature change proved fatal for his weakened body. The medical background of the official version rests on the physiological condition of the Sultan during the last months of his life. The physicians of that time, though lacking knowledge of hypertension, nevertheless recorded in the Sultan a heaviness in the head and flushes of heat. On that day, Selim entered the hot section of the hammam. The abrupt dilatation of blood vessels under the influence of scorching steam, combined with the already existing fragility of his vascular system, led to the rupture of an artery in the brain. The official chroniclers emphasized that the Sultan lost consciousness almost instantly, which ruled out any possibility of outside interference. Why exactly did a stroke become the convenient truth for the empire? The answer lies in the need to preserve the dignity of the dynasty. Death from illness was considered more proper, unlike an absurd accident or, even more so, a violent death. An important aspect of the official version is the description of the Sultan's final moments. Selim II did not die on the spot on the marble floor of the bathhouse. According to chronicles, he was carried unconscious to his private chambers, where the best physicians tried to bring him back to life. The Sultan thrashed in a fever, never regaining full consciousness. The official version of a stroke was also supported by testimony that the Sultan had complained of severe dizziness before even entering the bathhouse. For the empire's subjects, the Sultan's death was presented as a natural, albeit sad, conclusion to his earthly journey, marred only by the fact that he had not been able to give his final instructions to his heir. This official version recorded the medical fact, but left out details that soon gave rise to a whole host of alternative, far more scandalous accounts. Thus, popular rumor and the testimonies of some courtiers pointed to a far more frightening event,
a fall on the slippery floor. Sultan Selim II had decided to personally inspect the ongoing construction of the hammam. One careless step of a heavy, aging, and physically weakened sultan on such a surface could have led to a loss of balance and a sudden fall onto the marble floor. The medical side of this version looks extremely convincing. In a fall onto one's back or side, a person weighing over 80 kilograms, and Selim was quite corpulent by the end of his life, acquires a large amount of kinetic energy. A blow to the back of the head or the temple against a marble slab inevitably causes a severe traumatic brain injury. Modern neurosurgeons analyzing descriptions of the Sultan's condition after the incident point to a classic picture of a subdural hematoma, a brief loss of consciousness, followed by a period of apparent well-being, and then rapid brain swelling, paralysis, and death. Why might the version about the fall have been concealed? In the culture of that time, the death of a ruler from a banal fall was considered undignified and even shameful. Falling on a slippery floor looked like a sign of weakness, a lack of divine favor. Moreover, admitting that the Sultan had slipped cast a shadow on the architects and servants responsible for the palace's safety. It was simpler and safer to declare a sudden illness as the cause of death than to admit that the ruler of the greatest empire had been defeated by a piece of marble.
But there are far more unusual versions of the Sultan's death. Among the most unusual and enduring legends surrounding the death of Selim II, the leading one is a version that turns the tragedy in the hammam into a plot fit for a cheap novel, a chase after a young concubine. According to this myth, which was savored for centuries by European chroniclers and Istanbul gossips, on his last day, the Sultan was allegedly in a state of severe alcoholic intoxication. Catching sight of a beautiful girl from his harem in the semi-darkness and steam of the hammam, he impulsively rushed after her across the slippery marble tiles. The result of this ridiculous and unworthy pursuit was a fatal fall, a blow to the head, and subsequent death. This version sharply contrasts with the image of a repentant sultan who foresaw his own death, painting instead a caricatured portrait of a lecher who perished due to his own lack of self-control. In the 16th century Europe, the image of the Ottoman Sultan was shrouded in an aura of exotic vice. For Venetian and French diplomats, Selim II's death in pursuit of a girl fit perfectly into the overarching paradigm of the decline of the empire. It suited them to portray the son of the great Süleyman as a man who had traded state interests for wine in the harem. These chronicles often mention a specific variety of wine, Cypriot Malvasia, allegedly the catalyst for that fateful passion. However, modern historical analysis casts doubt on such gossip. The main argument against the chase version is Selim II's physical condition at the time of his death. As we already know, the Sultan suffered from serious health problems caused by a sudden abandonment of his habitual lifestyle. A man plagued by dizziness, a leaden weight in his head, and bouts of nausea could not physically have displayed such agility. At the age of 50, with a heavy build and a weakened heart, Selim was hardly capable of sprinting in the hammam, where even a healthy person finds it hard to breathe due to the high humidity and heat. Any attempt at sudden movement in such an environment would have led to immediate collapse, but certainly not to a prolonged chase. Furthermore, one must take into account the strictest etiquette and structured life of the Ottoman hammam. The Sultan was never in the bathhouse in such solitude as would allow for such liberties. The idea that the Padishah might chase after a concubine in full view of the guards is absurd from the standpoint of Ottoman protocol. The harem was a meticulously organized machine, not a place for chaotic games. The chase version completely ignores the reality of palace life, replacing it with fantasies aimed at the unsophisticated European commonplace.
Why has this myth proven so enduring? The answer is simple. It served as a powerful tool for political discrediting. After the death of Selim II, his reign began to be compared to the period of Süleyman the Magnificent, and the comparison was not in the son's favor. The narrative of death due to a foolish whim underscored the dynasty's degradation. But let us move on to the next versions.
Of course, the death of an Ottoman ruler always raises questions about poisoning. The shadow of poison always haunted Ottoman sovereigns, and Selim II was no exception. The version of deliberate poisoning remains one of the logically grounded hypotheses for his sudden passing. If we analyze the symptoms that plagued the Sultan in his final months, unbearable burning in the chest, debilitating headaches, and sudden bouts of weakness, we see a classic clinical picture of chronic poisoning with heavy metal salts or arsenic. Could the Sultan have fallen victim to a carefully plotted conspiracy whose goal was to clear the path to the throne for his son, Murad III? When examining the circle of suspects, historians first turn their gaze to the empire's external enemies. After the conquest of Cyprus and the humiliating defeat of the Venetians, the Republic of St. Mark had every motive to eliminate Selim II. The Venetians were renowned for their master poisoners, capable of creating a substance with no taste or smell that would kill a man not instantly but over several months, mimicking natural decline. The poison could have been added to the Sultan's favorite Cypriot wines, which explains his sudden and categorical refusal of alcohol shortly before his death. His fall in the hammam, in that case, would have been merely the final collapse of an already poisoned body. However, were there internal forces with an interest in the Padishah's death? Although Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmet Pasha wielded enormous power, he may have feared Selim's unpredictability during his depressive episodes, or the possible influence of other factions within the palace. The transfer of power to the young and still inexperienced Murad III would have allowed the vizier and Nurbanu Sultan to reset the political system and strengthen their positions. History knows of cases where it was precisely the medicines intended to treat the Sultan that became the means of his elimination. The Sultan's death in a closed hammam, where there were no prying eyes, gave the conspirators an ideal opportunity to present everything as an accident.
Could Nurbanu Sultan herself, the devoted wife and mother of the heir, have had a hand in her husband's cup? This seems unlikely, as her status depended on Selim II's life. The theory of slow poisoning explains the Sultan's strange melancholy and forebodings. The poisoning version transforms Selim II's death from an absurd accident into cold political calculation. The absence of any ability in the 16th century to perform autopsies and toxicological examinations has forever left this question open. Still, to this day, this version enjoys virtually no support among serious scholars. But while the very cause of death raises certain questions, what happened after the Sultan's demise is well known. The Padishah's death in a closed hammam presented his inner circle with a choice: announce the passing immediately and risk plunging the country into the chaos of internecine strife, or conceal the truth from the people, the army, and even members of the ruling dynasty. The chief architects of the conspiracy of silence were the two most powerful figures in the empire, Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha and the Sultan's lawful wife, Nurbanu Sultan. As soon as the physicians confirmed that there was no longer a pulse, the doors of the Sultan's chambers were shut to everyone. Nurbanu understood. Until her eldest son, Murad, who was in Manisa, set foot on Istanbul soil and ascended the throne, power remained in limbo. Although Murad was the officially recognized heir, his younger brothers, 5 Shehzades, were right there in Topkapı Palace, and at any moment they could become a banner for rebellious janissaries or ambitious officials. Selim II's body was immediately moved to the cold cellar of the palace, where it was placed in a special ice-lined box. To conceal the specific smell of decomposition, which would inevitably begin to spread through the harem corridors, the most expensive and potent incense was burned around the clock in the Sultan's chambers, and access to the body was granted only to 2 or 3 trusted individuals who had sworn to maintain silence. For the rest of the world, Selim II was officially ill,
Medicines were brought to the palace, servants carried trays of food into the empty chambers, and Sokolu Mehmed Pasha emerged before officials with forged decrees supposedly signed by the Padishah's weakening hand. The main objective was to buy time for the messenger racing to Manisa to reach Murad III. The letter carried by this rider was extremely brief, but contained the full weight of the Ottoman crown. Until Murad arrived, the army was not to know that the throne stood empty. Only when the ship carrying Murad III appeared on the Bosphorus horizon on December 21st, according to some accounts, he reached the capital on the night of the 22nd, did Sokolu Mehmed Pasha allow himself to breathe a sigh of relief. Murad secretly entered the palace through the garden gate, met with his mother and the Grand Vizier, and only after he had been officially proclaimed Sultan before the highest dignitaries of the state was Selim II's death announced publicly. The 12 days of silence ended with a magnificent period of mourning. Concluding our investigation into the death of Selim II, we see that the truth, as so often happens, lies somewhere between the dry official reports and the scandalous palace legends. Was it an absurd accident on slippery marble, a fatal stroke, or a carefully orchestrated conspiracy? Considering the Sultan's physical condition, his age, and his abrupt abandonment of his habitual lifestyle, the most realistic scenario appears to be a tragic combination of medical factors and a mishap. Selim II passed away at a moment of deep internal crisis, leaving behind an empire on the threshold of great change. Despite the Sultan's controversial reputation, it was under his rule that the Ottoman estate preserved the grandeur established by Süleyman. However, his sudden departure and the 12 days of silence following his death made it abundantly clear. From then on, the empire's fate depended not only on the Sultan's personality, but also on the iron will of those who knew how to weave intrigues in the shadow of the throne. The death in the hammam was the final chord in the life of a man who spent his whole life trying to live up to his great father, but ultimately remained in history as one of the most enigmatic figures of the dynasty. Which version of Selim II's demise seems most convincing to you? Do you believe in a fatal accident, or do you think the Padishah fell victim to a subtle political game? Share your opinion in the comments. If you are interested in delving into the mysteries of the lives and deaths of your favorite series characters, be sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon. Watch other videos about the secrets of the Ottoman palace and harem. There are even more unique facts there. What other topics would you like to see in our future videos? We await your ideas in the comments.